To be working with old colleagues in Professor Francis, Professor Baumer, and Kathleen too. It's old friends, old pals to be working together on the same project as I did so in the past. I also wanted to say thank you to our Thai hosts here, but also a profound Gamsahamnida to our Korean friends in terms of KMI for their unswerving support for the Catfish project, but also to Beyond Grid for making life very much easier for all of us to be here. Yeah, well, one of the comments that was made yesterday, I think it was Amy who said it, but possibly not alone, is that fish don't know where the boundaries are. And I think that's true, but I don't think we can entirely blame the fish for this, because as we'll see from the presentation, we don't necessarily know where all the boundaries are either. So you know, we can give the fish a bit of a pass on this one. What I'd like to do is take a little bit more of a look at the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which was just ably mentioned by Kathleen as one of the key binding documents that's applicable to pretty much every state that's represented in this room, and I'll demonstrate quite how comprehensive and successful the UN Convention has been in terms of the uptake from the international community. But what I will say about the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea from the outset is that it is a document that was negotiated over a 9-year period. It's incredible to think that 150 states contributed to that negotiation process and came out with a consensus-based document. Now, in order to achieve consensus where you have differing views, the key route to achieving an outcome of drafters is to come up with compromise language. And whenever you see an ambiguity and uncertainty in the provisions of the Law of the Sea Convention, you know there was a fight. So there's a lot of language that is capable of broad interpretation. And that was in order to achieve an outcome which everyone could live with the language and interpret to their own advantage. And that's what we see in the context of maritime delimitation. What I will say also is that this particular presentation is based on collaborative work with Professor Francis and also my former PhD student, now happily I can call him Dr. Aimade Andi Arsana from Indonesia, from Gajah Mada University. And that collaborative paper isn't quite accepted yet, but it is in the works to head towards publication, and hopefully we'll be able to share that in due course. A little bit of history, just one slide, looking at how, and to emphasize really that how new the network or mosaic of maritime zones that we have under the convention, it's only been enforced for 30 years. Prior to the 1982 convention, when the convention was open for signature, we did not even have agreement on the breadth of the territorial sea. So this zonal approach to maritime jurisdiction is our fundamental overarching governance mechanism. And that's why, even though it has Law of the Sea on the title, I'm a geographer by training, so I think of it in spatial, geographical terms. And the way we manage the oceans is fundamentally spatial. We'll deal with zones delineated by distance from baselines along the coast. We deal with maritime boundaries between states, which are defined by coordinates, points, joined by lines, so that we can find them again. There is a legal component to maritime delimitation. There is a technical or geographical component, but ultimately, of course, there's also a political component to it. So, over time, our zones, our claims offshore have extended further offshore. And gradually, because of the proximity of other states, other coastlines to our own, the overlaps have become more prominent, more numerous. The need for maritime boundaries has increased. We are by no means done. What I tend to say to my students is you open up an atlas and you generally find a familiar network of nice red lines showing division of land. Now that land political map of the world changes over time. At the breakup of the USSR, the breakup of former Yugoslavia, Eritrea breaking away from Ethiopia, South Sudan gaining independence, there is dynamism, change over time in the land map, but pretty much all of the land on the planet is divided up between states. For the oceans, it's an entirely different equation. So we have a great deal of uncertainty. Now, the point of the joint research with Professor Francis and Andy was to look at the intersection between IUU fishing, or particularly illegal fishing, and areas of the ocean subject to competing maritime claims, disputed zones. And here comes the caveat. We're part of a UN-oriented project. I'm not taking any position on any one country's zones of maritime jurisdiction and competing claims to maritime jurisdiction and maritime disputes, because we're going to take a tour around the region, and I don't mean to cause any of you offense in talking about your maritime claims versus your neighboring states. Pretty much every state in this room represented here has issues to resolve related to their baselines, the delineated outer limits to their maritime claims, and their maritime boundaries with neighboring states. This is not to pick on you or this region. There is no coastal state in the world that doesn't require at least one maritime boundary, because we have such broad maritime claims. If Hawaii was independent, and I'm not necessarily advocating that, then they would have a perfect bubble of 200 nautical mile limited exclusive economic zone and no overlaps. But they would be unique in that. So we'll look at that. We'll look at the potential intersection, the evidence for illegal fishing taking place in disputed waters, essentially areas of overlapping maritime claims, and then look at the obligations on coastal states. And every state here represented here is a party to the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, and there are therefore obligations on you as a coastal state how you deal with areas of overlap, areas of dispute. And we'll look at some of the provisions related to that. So, this is history. Up until the 1982 convention, there was a general consensus, but no codification, no agreement, that coastal states had what was called the cannon shot rule. You, as a coastal state, you could assert your rights over the ocean over a narrow band of territorial waters or territorial sea, out as far as you could throw a cannonball from the cannon. So about 3 nautical miles, unless you are Norwegian. In which case the Norwegians always claimed a 4 nautical mile territorial waters because they said their cannon were better. You can see where this can lead to an arms race over time, potentially. But most states were claiming 3 nautical miles, traditionally. But with the advent of particularly technology allowing fishing further and further offshore, and especially the exploitation of seabed oil and gas from the 1940s onwards in shallow areas of the continental shelf, states wanted to claim more. And that's what we gradually had. These are the first 2 modern maritime boundaries, firstly between Sweden and Norway over the Grisbedana Banks, which was an arbitration, a sort of court setting to resolve an overlapping claims, and it was driven by access to fish. The fishing grounds of the Grisbedana Banks, which ultimately were divided between Sweden and Norway. The bottom image is the Gulf of Paria between Trinidad and Tobago and Venezuela, and the United Kingdom, on behalf of Trinidad and Tobago and Venezuela, drew a line through the continental shelf in 1942 in order to clarify access to seabed oil and gas. Marine resources are a major driver for maritime delimitation because states like certainty, and the oil and gas industry in particular also likes fiscal and legal certainty because they take the risk. They take the millions of dollars of investment, maybe $100 million to drill one single hole, one well. They take the risk, but they need to know that they're going to get the return on investment, which means they need to know where the limits of coastal state rights end. So what we've had with the broader zones of jurisdiction is a proliferation of overlapping maritime claims, therefore a proliferation and an increase in the number of potential maritime boundaries, and surprise, surprise, more and more disputes. This is a convention which you'll be familiar with as a concept. We'll look at the maritime zones in a moment, but it's remarkable how successful this is. We have 172 parties to the convention, 171 states plus the European Union. When you consider that there are only 152 coastal states within the UN system, that's pretty impressive uptake of this international convention. In our region, in Southeast Asia, for the ASEAN states, all of them now are parties to the convention. Just in February of this year, Cambodia acceded to the convention, and that completed the set, with the caveat that Taiwan, as the Republic of China, not being a UN member state, cannot become a party to the convention. So, nonetheless, you have multiple non-parties to the convention which conduct their ocean affairs in line with the convention. So Taiwan claims baselines and an EEZ and territorial sea just like other coastal states that are party to the convention. The one big exception is the United States. Now, the United States contributed substantially to the drafting of the convention, but then, for domestic reasons, has not become a party to it. Nonetheless, its oceans policy, up until the current administration at least, has been conducted in line with the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, and the United States has indicated that it regards the majority of the convention as being reflective of customary international law and therefore binding on the United States. First key point in legal terms. Now, I am a geographer, but I've been hanging around with lawyers possibly too long for my own health. Legally, you can only claim maritime jurisdiction if you are a state. So private entities cannot do so. And as a state, you need coastal territory. You need territory above high tide. You need land. And that can be, that above high tide bit and naturally formed can be an important requirement. We can talk about issues around expanding your land territory through reclamation and from the sea and so forth. But ultimately, the land dominates the sea. And I like Prosper Vile's quote, it does so through the intermediary of the coastal front. Geography is not fair. Not every state has the same length or the same coastal front at all. One example which I liked was Iraq is a relatively large state. It was described as a pretty big garage with a really small door because its coastal front is so narrow. So it doesn't matter about the area you have as a state, it's all about the coastal front. From your coastal front, from the baselines along your coast, you generate zones of jurisdiction. A territorial sea out to 12 nautical miles, a contiguous zone out to 24 nautical miles measured from baselines, exclusive economic zone out to 200 nautical miles, again measured from baselines. And I'll just pause that there, go back one, because the important thing here is this line. At the limit of your territorial sea, you have sovereignty over your land and sovereignty over your territorial sea. Beyond the territorial sea limit, you find specific sovereign rights. And most of those sovereign rights are oriented towards marine resources, towards fisheries, traditionally, and seabed oil and gas. But these days, the oceans are considerably busier places. So we have a lot more activities and a much greater intensity of use, particularly close to the coast. But that division between areas under sovereignty and sovereign rights matters, particularly from a navigation point of view. Now, the United States is not a party to the Law of the Sea Convention, but it is the serial complainer, the serial protester. So the US undertakes a freedom of navigation program and analyzes the maritime claims and legislation of every coastal state globally. And if it doesn't agree with your maritime claims, it will diplomatically let you know, try and persuade you to change your practice. And if you don't, then you will end up with a protest from the United States, where the United States reserves its rights. And that's perfectly reasonable for the US to do. In a way, it protects the rest of the international community from excessive claims by preventing the formation of customary international law through that protest. If you continue to do something which the US disagrees with, and that potentially has an impact on navigation, which is what the US is most concerned with, having the maximum area of the ocean where they can sail large gray-painted vessels, you may well get a US warship transiting through your maritime space without asking permission, because they believe that they have the right to do so. That's an operational assertion of right, which is what the US will undertake to protect freedom of navigation. One final point on the US is that the US tend to talk about international waters. You won't find that term in the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. What they mean is that the navigational freedoms in the high seas exist all the way up to the limits of the territorial sea. That's what the US means by international waters. And even within the territorial sea, there is the right of navigation through innocent passage. So what the US is concerned about is mainly about navigational freedoms. Now, we may have a mainland state, we may have an island state, that is potentially an archipelagic state composed of islands or parts of islands, and we may have complexities along the coast which allows you to provide for various different types of baselines, which is a whole different lecture about those complexities. But you might have deeply indented or cut into coastline, islands offshore, defining straight baselines or bay closing lines along your coast. You may have an archipelagic state with archipelagic baselines, and we have Indonesia and the Philippines here as two examples of major archipelagic states. And then from your baselines, you measure your 12-mile territorial sea, your contiguous zone to 24 nautical miles, and your exclusive economic zone. And that essentially is what we're dealing with in this particular discussion, those overlaps between states. And the usual way in which these overlaps are dealt with is through negotiating a division, just like that. That could be the end of the lecture right there, but unfortunately it's not always so easy to draw that red line. Not least because the guidance you get from the Convention for EEZ and continental shelf delimitation is extremely slight. In terms of the codified rules, you simply have to find an equitable solution, a fair outcome. Trouble is, my version of fair is not likely to be your version of fair. So that gives you huge flexibility, but also great scope for dispute. Most disputes are caused by a desire by each state to gain access to resources, fisheries primarily, also in terms of seabed hydrocarbons. I know this is a fisheries-oriented audience, but I'm sorry to have to tell you that most policymakers seem to find oil sexier than fish. Fish move, so oil doesn't necessarily. And there is a law of oil and gas resources. For all of the areas of overlapping maritime space, almost always someone in the media will say, aha, it's oil rich, as well as the fisheries resources. I think usually the obsession with oil takes the attention away from the renewable resource, which is really important from a food security point of view, from a livelihoods point of view, as we were showing yesterday. You can also have disputes over territory. Whenever you have a dispute on sovereignty over territory that has a coast, you automatically have a maritime dispute as well as a land dispute. That's particularly in this part of the world, it's relevant to disputes over islands. If you dispute sovereignty over an island between states, you automatically get a maritime dimension as well as a territorial. And we're familiar with that. Pulau Sipadan and Ligatan between Indonesia and Malaysia, Pedra Branca or Pulau Batu Putih between Singapore and Malaysia, and the South China Sea as a principal example. We'll look at that in a moment. You also have historic claims. We had it's often the case that states will say, well, we've traditionally fished these waters. One of the reasons Thailand was resistant and a relatively late adopter of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea is Thailand's quote-unquote traditional fishing grounds were covered by the exclusive economic zone claims of other Southeast Asian states. And that was part of the resistance of Thailand to the whole idea of the exclusive economic zone. But now Thailand is on board. Baseline issues. There are a lot of different types of baseline that can be defined along your coastline for certain geographical complexities, which we can go into in detail if you so wish. But you can change the area of overlapping maritime claims as a result of your baseline claims, as shown on that little diagram at the bottom of the screen. Islands. If you dispute sovereignty, you also have a maritime dispute, but also the issue is what type of island are we dealing with? The regime of islands, which is quite a grand title, is covered by Article 121 of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. It's composed of one article of 3 paragraphs. It essentially says that an island must be naturally formed, composed of land, above water at high tide, and surrounded by water. Well, surprise, it's an island. That's relatively uncontroversial. The second paragraph of the provision says that you treat islands in just the same way as you treat all of your other land territory. So you have the full suite, full range of zones of jurisdiction. But it says at paragraph 3, rocks which cannot sustain human habitation or an economic life of their own shall have no EEZ or continental shelf. So many of the maritime disputes that we have are not about sovereignty over islands, they're about what status they have. Are they fully entitled to maritime claims, to broad claims to EEZ and continental shelf, or are they mere rocks? And ultimately, if it's my feature, clearly it's an island that's capable of an EEZ and continental shelf claim. If it's yours, well, that's a rock. And that summarizes many of the maritime disputes that we have in this region and globally. And it matters. That classification, that argument over whether a feature is a fully entitled island or is a mere rock, has a huge potential influence. If you're a fully entitled island with no neighbors, you generate over 125,000 square nautical miles of maritime jurisdiction. If you're a mere rock, it's 452. So that issue of classification, and therefore whether such features can be used as base points for delimiting a maritime boundary, is a critical consideration. Now, this is the issue about the incomplete nature of the mosaic of maritime boundaries on a global scale. And of course, with any calculation of the number of potential maritime boundaries, it really depends how you count. So here, for example, is the United States and Canada one, or is it, I count it as four, because there are four distinct segments of delimiting maritime boundaries between Washington State and British Columbia, between British Columbia and Alaska, between Alaska and Yukon in the Arctic, and also in the Atlantic for the Gulf of Maine. On that basis, we have 454 potential maritime boundaries around the world. And we have 240 with agreements in force. So only just over half. We have a long way to go in terms of completing the picture. That doesn't include the Caspian Sea, because we tend not to think of the Caspian as part of the global ocean. You can only access it through rivers and canals. Even though it's a large body of water, it's salty, but it's not connected to the global ocean. It doesn't include areas beyond 200 nautical miles. And for extended continental shelf, we currently have about 35 million square kilometers of submission area before the United Nations Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf, of which about 3.3 million square kilometers overlap with one another. So we're only just over halfway to completing the picture within 200 miles, and we have further maritime boundaries to delimit beyond the 200 nautical mile limit. Many of those boundaries also are incomplete. Singapore and Indonesia have delimited segments of their territorial sea. In 1974, in 2009, and 2014. 3 separate agreements, 3 separate sections, dividing up, slicing it up. And that's one approach to a delimitation. Agree as far as you can. Other states take the view that nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. So you can have trade-offs in different areas of your delimitation picture. But any agreement also that predates 1982 and the advent of the exclusive economic zone is usually a continental shelf agreement, not for water column. So you have lines that are simply for dividing the shelf that have yet to be upgraded, if you will, to a water column boundary, therefore relevant to fisheries, or at least free swimming fisheries. But there is a bit of a difference between simply having an undelimited, undefined boundary and actually having an active dispute. And often it's the discovery of marine resources which leads to the dispute becoming more active. Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire in West Africa had a gentleman's agreement on where the maritime boundary was, right up until Ghana found 6 billion barrels of oil. And then all of a sudden they have an overlapping claim and ended up before the International Tribunal on the Law of the Sea. In terms of overlapping claims, disputed waters, and fisheries, this is the concept diagram for the paper that Francis and I have been writing with Andy, where you have ambiguity over who has jurisdiction over a particular maritime space. There is literature that calls that, well, that's potentially ungoverned space. It's a black hole in the ocean that will provide an opportunity for unscrupulous operators, unscrupulous fishers, to undertake IUU fishing because of the hesitation of enforcement authorities to intervene in that disputed zone and therefore potentially cause an incident. The counterpoint to that argument is that actually you can find disputed areas are probably more heavily patrolled than anywhere else, because coastal states are watchful for their neighbor undertaking acts of administration, what in legal terms is called effectivité. The idea of, this is the third strand, of creating a track record of presence, and therefore potentially with an impact over jurisdiction. The middle line talks about the issue of competitive access to the same space. So there you can have state A licensing fishing to its fishing vessels, its fishers. That, if those fishers then fish in a disputed zone, automatically for the other state, it's illegal fishing, and vice versa. So in a way, this inflates the statistics or the incidence of illegal fishing. Finally, states use fishers. Fishers can be proxies for the coastal state. You have subsidies for fishers, that's one of the issues that we dealt with in this 2 weeks. And in certain circumstances, the coastal state will be able to direct the fishers to, in a sense, represent the state in a disputed zone, to lay down evidence of practice. We've always fished in this zone. It strengthens our claim to this disputed space. That has the potential to cause friction between rival fishing fleets and rival enforcement authorities, and that has the potential to escalate in terms of a threat to international peace and security. Now, I will say that if you are going to an international court or tribunal, many states will throw every argument at the court, including affidavits from fishermen saying, yes, we've always fished in this disputed space. Generally, that has not proved effective before an international court or tribunal deciding on a case on the basis of international law, not least because it's relatively easy for the other side to say, well, we have done too. And it's difficult to provide compelling evidence that your fishers, have fished that particular area to the exclusion of the other side. In order for a court to find that there should be a boundary in place, a de facto boundary on the basis of fishing practice, to become a de jure, a permanent maritime boundary, the threshold is set very high. So that type of maritime practice, maritime effectivité, is not compelling before an international court or tribunal, generally. Now, this is starting our tour of the region, focused on ASEAN states. And in a way, we'll start with the rule, the exception to the rule. Because here we have the Andaman Sea, and what we've done is color in areas of dispute in red, and you don't see any red. Remarkably, the Andaman Sea, you have geographical complexity in terms of India's Andaman Islands, you have the archipelagic state and claims of Indonesia to the south, you have lots of islands along the coast and strait baselines belonging to Thailand, very long, potentially excessive strait baselines belonging to Myanmar, as well as lots of tiny islands which potentially have an influence. Despite that complexity, Myanmar, Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Thailand have managed to come up with a nearly complete set of maritime boundaries, in spite of all of that geographical complexity. It doesn't necessarily mean that IUU fishing is missing from this area. Particularly in the Andaman Islands and Nicobar Islands, you have the conditions which are friendly for sea cucumber, and poaching of sea cucumber, particularly from Myanmarese fishers. In the Malacca Strait, you already have agreement from 1969, this was mentioned yesterday, continental shelf agreement through the Malacca Strait, and territorial sea agreement on the southern part of the strait between Malaysia and Indonesia. However, you've got a broad area of overlap. Why? Because 1969 predates the 1982 Law of the Sea Convention. It's only for continental shelf. Indonesia tended to be quite generous in its delimitation agreements with neighboring states. In the run-up to the third conference on the Law of the Sea, Indonesia wanted to secure general acceptance of the idea of archipelagic states, and therefore was rather generous to neighbors and ended up with maritime boundaries for shelf, which are closer to Indonesia than the neighboring state, including Malaysia. So Malaysia would like to turn the existing continental shelf boundary agreement into an EEZ agreement for water column 2. Indonesia wants to go back to the equidistance line between the two states. So you have an area of overlap. I was told by the Attorney General of one regional state that if you are going to sink in your ship, the place to do it is in this red zone, because each side will race to come and rescue you, because that will be an act of administration demonstrating that they have jurisdiction over that space. So please, if you are going to have a maritime casualty, please sink here. South China Sea, probably the biggest, most famous arena for maritime conflict and competing maritime claims globally. You have multiple sovereignty disputes. Whoops, I'll go back one. In terms of disputes over the Paracel Islands between Vietnam and China, disputes over Pratas Islands, which are administered by Taiwan, but also, of course, claimed by the People's Republic of China. Dispute over Scarborough Reef or Scarborough Shoal between Philippines and China. Macclesfield Bank is often associated with Scarborough Reef, and particularly by the China as part of the Zhongsha Island group. Macclesfield Bank has a least depth over it of 23 meters depth. It is not an island, so it's not part of an island group. It is a completely and permanently submerged feature. And most famously, the Spratly Island group in the southern part of the South China Sea. From a fisheries perspective, the South China Sea is crucially important. These figures are from the Boomore Bust report by the what used to be the UBC Fisheries Center, indicating 12% of global catch caught in the South China Sea alone, which is a relatively limited 3 to 3.5 million square kilometers of the ocean, producing potentially an enormous catch coming out of it. Worth over $21 billion in 2012, involving 3.7 million people and their livelihoods and the food security associated with that. There's abundant illegal fishing, not least because you have such broad overlapping claims. So these dashes are China's famous 9-dashed or 9-dotted line. I'll come back to that in a moment. But what I wanted to go forward to is that orange indication. China claims the 9-dash line. If you join those dashes up, it's around 80% of the South China Sea is subject to competing maritime claims. So you have enormous illegal fishing from the perspective of one state over other claimants. I'll just go back a little bit on that. This is an incident from 10 years ago. Why am I showing that? because it gives you a really good example and impression of the asymmetry in play in the South China Sea. This is a case between Indonesia arresting an illegal fishing vessel off the Natuna Islands in the southwest of the South China Sea. And in the picture, that is the Indonesian Navy vessel. That's the Chinese Coast Guard vessel. China often uses white-painted vessels, Coast Guard, so quasi-military, paramilitary forces rather than the Navy to de-escalate to some extent. But those Coast Guard vessels completely outmatch often the enforcement authorities of the South China Sea coastal states, of Philippines, Malaysia, Indonesia, Brunei. And that is a salutary lesson in how illegal fishing and IUU fishing is dealt with in the South China Sea space. We have a lot of evidence too in terms of use of unsustainable fishing practices and fishing for endangered species. So this is one of the images from the South China Sea Tribunal, the arbitration tribunal between Philippines and China. And I should admit here that I was an independent expert witness appointed by the Philippines in that case. And this illustrates the harvesting of giant clams by Chinese fishing vessel in the South China Sea. When you look at how the statistics for how these fisheries in the South China Sea are going, yes, there's enormous growth over time, but you can certainly see also a plateauing of catch and landed value also. The estimate from the UBC Fisheries Center is that of the reported catch, you then should add another 70% in unreported catch. Huge numbers in terms of the importance of the South China Sea in terms of biodiversity hotspot and in supporting very, very productive fisheries. But also you have key ecosystems like mangroves and coral reefs suffering significant decline over time. This is just for Indonesia over a 30-year period from 1975 to 2005, but catch per unit effort from 156 down to about 50. So these are indicators of what we touched on yesterday, fishing down the food web and stress on the fishery. If the South China Sea Tribunal's decision, which of course China did not participate in that arbitration and rejected it as no more than so much waste paper, to quote a foreign ministry spokesman, if that decision was upheld, then we'd have a significant shrinking of the area of overlap in the South China Sea. Because the tribunal found that none of the islands under consideration, none of the features should be considered fully entitled islands. Legally, they are rocks. In addition to that, China's 9-dash line claim, as soon as China became a party to the Law of the Sea Convention, the zones available to China under the Law of the Sea Convention, they became primary. So any historical claim by China which is incompatible with the zones of jurisdiction under UNCLOS, including those of Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei, and the Philippines, and Indonesia, those historic claims of China become irrelevant, erased. And China was found to have caused severe harm to the coral reef environment and violated its obligation under the convention to protect and preserve the marine environment, primarily through large-scale island building. Now, I would point out that China is not alone in island building. And just recently, we've had reports of island building by Vietnam. Malaysia has done so. Republic of China has done so. Pretty much every coastal state that is an occupant on the disputed features has undertaken some form of island building. Indonesia regards itself as a non-claimant in the context of the South China Sea disputes. What that means is that Indonesia doesn't claim any of the disputed islands, but certainly Indonesia claims maritime space in the southwest part of the South China Sea, which overlaps with China's historic nine-dashed line claims. In the Gulf of Thailand, we have a number of agreements and a number of joint arrangements to look at. It's quite a hot spot for joint arrangements. The joint historic waters area between Cambodia and Vietnam, the Thai-Malaysia JDA, which has been relatively successful in that oil and gas has been found, and the defined area between Malaysia and Vietnam. All those two arrangements are focused on oil and gas, not fisheries. The motivator, again, is the lure of oily wealth. This one is due to expire in 2029. So there are issues there, what Malaysia and Thailand will do about that joint zone. I read recently in one article that in the opinion of the authors, the likelihood would be to go to court. I would say that, well, with 22 operating oil fields in the JDA, and that gas being brought onshore through a pipeline, we have a successful JDA, and probably I would think that that would be renewed, would be the simplest answer. And the most recent development concerns this red area, which was subject to a memorandum of understanding between Cambodia and Thailand signed in 2001. So it's over 25 years old. And Thailand, earlier this year, revoked it, tore it up. Now, Cambodia, which is only in February became a party to the Law of the Sea Convention, is invoking compulsory conciliation under the Law of the Sea. And just yesterday, Thailand announced that it accepted that process and appointed 2 conciliators to match the 2 that have been chosen by Cambodia. So that process is going forward. This is, in a way, a positive step. We have every state now a party within the region, a party to the Law of the Sea Convention, and we have a peaceful process of conciliation going forward in relation to that broad area of overlap, which is significant for fisheries, but also particularly significant for oil and gas, because the Patani Trough runs through this area. You have a whole series of oil and gas fields, mainly gas fields on the Thai side, just outside of the red zone. So it's been described as some of the most prospective acreage in the world is that area, particularly in this central part between the 2 sides. And the areas of overlap are essentially the result of self-serving interpretations of the middle line, the equidistance line, giving your own islands full weight and ignoring the other sides. That's how you get the overlap. But we certainly have long-term issues related to illegal fishing in the Gulf of Thailand. There was a period in the 1980s, 1990s, where Thailand's distant water fishing fleet, in order to come home, would need to transit through either Cambodian, Vietnamese, or Malaysian waters. And there was always a suspicion on the Malaysian side that Thai fishing vessels were fishing as they went. And therefore that caused substantial friction between Malaysia and Thailand. And it was one of the reasons why this joint development area, having been signed in the 1990s, took 11 years to go from a memorandum of understanding to a full agreement. Partly the friction between the states over fisheries access. The tri-border sea area, so-called, the area, Sulawesi or Celebes Sea, lying to the east of Borneo, to the south of the Philippines, been described as ungoverned maritime space. The idea that there's a lack of boundaries, a lack of jurisdiction, a lack of agreement, and a lack of capacity to enforce. That has changed over time. There was rampant IUU fishing in the 1990s and 2000s. There is now trilateral cooperation on maritime surveillance and enforcement, the imaginatively called Indo-Malfi for Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines, collaborating to try and enforce. There's also been progress in maritime delimitation. There's agreement, this solid line, numbered line, between Philippines and Indonesia. There we have the Indonesian claim line, you have the Malaysian claim line, and in the middle there are the islands of Sipadan, Pulau Sipadan and Pulau Ligitan. Indonesia and Malaysia went to the International Court of Justice not to resolve the maritime boundary, simply to determine sovereignty over those features. And ultimately, Malaysia was determined to have sovereignty over those features. Often the disputes over islands relate to peripheral features, features that there's the least administration over. There's the least evidence of administration. So what was crucial to prove Malaysian ownership, sovereignty over those features, was the fact that the British North Borneo Company that now had control over what is now Sabah province of Malaysia regulated the collection of turtle eggs on Pulau Sipadan and Pulau Ligitan. So that regulation, that act of administration by the authorities that ultimately became part of Malaysia, was important to proving that Malaysia should have sovereignty over those features. Indonesia, for example, indicated our Navy has always patrolled around these features. Our fishers have always fished around these features. But the other side can say that too for maritime effectivity or active administration. The additional complication here, though, involves our Filipino friends. Philippines also claims the whole of Sabah and tried to intervene in that case before the International Court of Justice between Indonesia and Malaysia, but was unsuccessful in doing so. And honestly, I don't think Indonesia will be easily persuaded to go back to the International Court of Justice since that case, since losing that case and losing sovereignty over Pulau Sipadan and Ligitan. And finally, on our tour, this is a bit of a complexity, and our friend from Timor-Leste will be well aware that there is now an agreed permanent maritime boundary between Australia and Timor-Leste, thanks to another process of compulsory conciliation, and a successful one in terms of yielding a permanent maritime boundary. But what's of interest here from a fisheries point of view is that in the 1970s, when the idea of natural prolongation, the connection between your land territory into and under the sea into the continental shelf, that was a powerful argument. And there is a deep trough, the Timor Trough, between Timor and Australia, but much nearer to Timor-Leste. So the line was pushed. The continental shelf boundary line is much nearer to Indonesia than it is to Australia. Later, we have equidistant spaceline. So this hashed area, you have Australian continental shelf and Indonesian water column. So there have been instances where Australian patrols are patrolling to prevent poaching of sedentary species, species that are in their harvestable stage permanently in contact with the shelf, with the seafloor. And on occasion, Australia has arrested Indonesian vessels and then later determined that they weren't trying to take crustaceans. They weren't trying to take sea cucumber. They weren't trying to take sedentary resources. They were actually fishing for free-swimming Indonesian fish. And because the Australian practice is if you arrest a vessel and the captain of the patrol boat deems that vessel to be unseaworthy, they won't tow it back to port. They'll burn it and sink it. So the Australian authorities have had to compensate wrongly apprehended Indonesian fishers, not only for their apprehension, but they have also had to buy them a new boat as a consequence of that complexity of jurisdiction and governance, where you have one state has sovereign rights over the shelf, and the other state has sovereign rights over the water column. That makes for, from an enforcement and patrol point of view, a nightmare to try and enforce. How am I doing for time? Just about getting, I can see Professor Neat, he's lurking. He's very tall, and he's a presence at the corner of my eye, so I know I'm running out of time. But quick discussion. We have areas of jurisdictional uncertainty throughout Southeast Asia. Potentially large areas of uncertainty, certainly particularly in the South China Sea. Potentially that uncertainty can lead to opportunity for unscrupulous fishers, for IUU fishing. You have a rather unhelpful scenario. We generally are talking about IUU. The I is illegal. But where you have an overlap, you potentially inflate the incidence of IUU fishing, of illegal fishing. Because even if you hold a license from your coastal state, automatically that's illegal fishing from the perspective of the other state that claims the same maritime space. And I'm not sure that's really helpful to our discussion about IUU. And then you have maybe geopolitical fishing, where fishers are used as proxies by the coastal state to support their claim to a particular area. Now, I think that's pretty senseless if you are ever going to go to court, because I'm not sure those arguments will work. But the vast majority of boundaries offshore are decided through negotiations, not going to an international court or tribunal. So ultimately, do we have a bleak picture? Well, arguably yes, in terms of many fisheries being under pressure, and that is not helped by jurisdictional uncertainty. But we do have some progress. Cambodia becoming a party to the convention, you have an ongoing peaceful conciliation process, which won't necessarily yield a positive result, like in the Timor Sea, because you had a particular set of circumstances. It's positive that Thailand is participating and has accepted the process. I was not necessarily going to bet that Thailand would, because Cambodia has initiated the process. It's almost a surprise for Thailand to be dragged into the conciliation. If Thailand participates in the way Australia didn't want the conciliation with Timor-Leste. But ultimately, Australia decided to engage in good faith, to reach an outcome positively, because conciliation is essentially a managed or facilitated negotiation. The Conciliation Commission will produce a non-binding report. You still need the two states involved to engage. And it's unclear whether Cambodia and Thailand will do so, because in the Timor Sea, Australia and Timor-Leste were not getting on. Politically, it was at a low ebb. But Cambodia and Thailand just last year have been shooting at each other on the land boundary. The real issue is the land boundary, not the maritime. So whether that maritime conciliation will be successful will be very interesting to see. Finally, I would say, where you have an overlapping maritime claim, you are obliged under the convention, now we're all parties to the Law of the Sea Convention, to try and seek an outcome, a positive outcome. There's an obligation not to jeopardize or hamper the reaching of a final agreement. Now that is an affirmative obligation on the coastal state, but you don't have to agree. It's an obligation of conduct. You must negotiate in good faith. You must try not to hamper the reaching of an outcome. But ultimately, you don't have to agree between neighboring states. We have a little bit of jurisprudence, of practice of international courts and tribunals on this, what these obligations mean, but they're oriented towards oil and gas, not fisheries. Between Guyana and Suriname, there was a broad area of overlap. Guyana authorized oil and gas exploration, didn't inform Suriname. Then at the last minute, offered to negotiate with Suriname. Ultimately, both Guyana and Suriname were found to be in breach of their obligations by the arbitration tribunal in that case, because Guyana had not informed, not negotiated, not cooperated with Suriname. Suriname had refused the last-minute negotiations, sent out a patrol boat that ordered the exploration vessel to leave within 12 hours, a threat of the use of force to resolve the issue. So both sides were in the wrong of breaching their obligations. What was really interesting about that case, though, is that it clarified that where you have an overlapping area, it doesn't mean you can't do any activity or authorize any activity. You still have sovereign rights over the area of overlap, even if the other state also claims sovereign rights. Therefore, yes, you can undertake certain activities that do not harm the marine environment. Now, this is oil and gas oriented, so the idea of seismic survey, yes, that's okay. But test drilling, no, that's impermissible. Now, how do we interpret that, which is oriented to oil and gas, towards fisheries? Can you undertake some fishing in a disputed area? Probably yes. But how much? What's the sustainable level in an area of dispute where both sides are fishing? That's unclear. And then, I'm out of time, aren't I, Francis? We have the potential for provisional arrangements of a practical nature, which generally translates to joint development zones. And that will be included in the slides and the paper that we will eventually put out. Ultimately, there are a lot of examples. Most of them are concerned with oil and gas. The broad divide is between having a joint zone and a boundary line, or a joint zone instead of a boundary line. Good example is between Papua New Guinea and Australia, and really is a joint non-development zone. There is a protected area around the whole of the Torres Strait, and the focus is on the fisheries, traditional fishing rights of the Torres Strait Islander people and environmental protection. And there's a prohibition on oil and gas exploration. Further examples in our part of the world, the East China Sea, just to the north of Southeast Asia, where we are now, you have multiple joint fishing arrangements. Now, if your glass is half full, these are positive examples of cooperation between coastal states under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. If your glass tends to be half empty, well, they overlap with one another. They're by no means holistic. They don't cover the whole area of the fishery, and they're flag state-based. So Korea will enforce against Korean vessels, Korean flagged vessels in the joint zone, not Chinese. China will enforce against Chinese flagged vessels. Now, there have been thousands upon thousands of incidents in the joint zone between Korea and South Korea and China, and in the area much closer, in undisputed Republic of Korea waters. Violent incidents between Chinese fishers and Korea Coast Guard. So not all of these joint zones work. They require the political will of the states concerned to control their own fishes. Finally, there are obligations under the Convention, even in an area of disputed waters. There are due publicity obligations which are important from the point of view of defining where your baselines, the limits of your maritime zones are, and your maritime boundaries and your maritime claims. Those due publicity obligations are becoming more and more important in an era of sea level rise, because it's those obligations that particularly the South Pacific states have been using to define and fix their baselines, limits, and boundaries, and therefore fix and retain their maritime entitlements against the threat of sea level rise and erosion of their coasts. We do have obligations also in disputed zones about our conduct as coastal states. And if you end up dragged before an international court or tribunal, as is possible, particularly the International Tribunal on the Law of the Sea, for a fisheries-related dispute with another party to the convention, which is all of your neighbors, then you need to be aware of those obligations under the convention not to jeopardize or hamper the reaching of a final agreement. And that will probably see me out to coffee and release you into a caffeine enhancement period. And we have untested issues over quite how those obligations on states apply in the context of fisheries, but there is always the option of maritime joint development. So thank you very much for your kind attention. Sorry I've run a tiny bit over, and we now are on for a break. Francis, thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Clive.